Hello everyone and welcome back to JAS Reviews. My name is James and on this channel I do reviews of both music and movies along with the occasional commentary piece. So if any of that sounds interesting to you then I'd appreciate it if you left this video a like and subscribe to my channel to see more videos like that. And today I'm doing another episode of quick album reviews. It seems like the last one did pretty well, so I am going to continue to push this series forward. I'm going to be altering the formula of it a little bit. I know last time I said I would keep it to 10 albums, but I think this is probably going to replace my Critical Corner series, honestly. I think I like the format better, the more casual feel of it. But I will continue to alter it and see what works. But today I'm going to be talking about 9 different albums and my quick thoughts on them. So let's go ahead and get started with the first album I'll be discussing. So first we'll be discussing an artist that is of course very popular now, an ex-member of One Direction who has had 2 solo albums that have both done very well, and that is Harry Styles with his 3rd album, Harry's House. I will say that I think this album is once again a step down again. Unfortunately, I feel like he's not really doing the classic rock sound that he did so well on his first album. He was already taking a step away from that on his 2nd album, and on his 3rd album it seems like he's divorced himself from that sound almost entirely. There's still some hints of a little bit of rock here and there, but I really think it's more of a comfortable alternative sound that he's going for. It's not necessarily a sound that I'm the hugest fan of, but that doesn't mean the album is terrible. In fact, I'd say it's pretty decent all around. There are some really strong standouts here. I think As It Was, the lead single, is actually really great and one that I've returned to very often. The same goes for Little Freak, which I do think is actually the best song on the album personally. Just a simple acoustic-led song with some layering of Harry's vocals that creates some really beautiful harmonies, and I really appreciate that Harry is staying in a vocal range that's more comfortable for him. There are some places on here where he goes to a vocal range that I'm not sure he is entirely comfortable with, and when he's staying in that lower range, I think he does really well there. Unfortunately, this album just isn't that memorable to me. A lot of it defaults to background noise in my opinion, not particularly unpleasant background noise in my opinion, but most songs here just don't leave me with much of an impression. I will say there's an exception to the not unpleasant rule, and that is Music for a Sushi Restaurant. I cannot stand this song. I hate the heavily processed falsettos in it, and the use of food in this particular way, and I'm sure you know the way I'm talking about if you've heard the song, just has never been particularly appealing to me. I always find it sort of eye-rolling more than anything else. I will also say that Daylight feels like a very generic sort of yacht rock song. It really does nothing at all for me, and I think the closing songs like Keep Driving and Satellite just sort of come and go without leaving much of an impression at all. And honestly, there's not really a whole lot to say about this album. I like that Harry talks about being happy in this new relationship that he has with Olivia Wilde, but at the same time, the content just doesn't leave me much to dig into at the end of the day outside of a couple of select tracks. But still, this album isn't bad at the end of the day, it's passable, and for that reason I'm going to give it a light 3 out of 5 stars. The moments on here I really did enjoy, but there are definitely some very forgettable moments that make this not stand as tall as Harry's previous 2 albums. Next, let's talk about an album that I was not sure what I was going to be getting into with Thornhill's sophomore album, Heroine. I absolutely love Thornhill's debut, The Dark Pool. It has steadily grown on me, and I think it's one of those legendary gent metalcore combination albums out there. It's become one of my favorites, honestly. I'll admit, this album's singles really threw me off guard. And in fact, I almost didn't like the first single, Casanova. In fact, I would say that I didn't like it the first time I heard it. I just had the feeling that maybe these songs would work better in the context of the album, and maybe I would understand them better there. And that was definitely the case because, wow, this album is excellent. This is a great continuation of Thornhill's sound, a great evolution of it, I would say, a total evolution almost. There are definitely some points where you can see the remnants of Darkpool, and I mentioned the shoegaze textures in the Darkpool because this album goes full on with that sound pretty much in every track. It is shoegaze to the fullest with definite Deftones vibes in there as well. From the start, we get really right into it with the Hellfire Club, a song that just really pulls you in and creates an interesting soundscape. And it establishes the album's themes of love and the different ways that the band is going to look at love. Sometimes in ways that are very heartbreaking, other times in ways that are very twisted. It really explores love in every possible sense. And I think it builds a very intriguing theme on it. And then Leather Wings comes out, which is, in my opinion, should have been the lead single of the album because this is the one that is closest to Thornhill's original sound. In fact, in some ways, it almost does fit on the Darkpool in some places. And there's even this just massive, brutal screaming section at the end that really threw me off guard. It doesn't ever happen again in the album, unfortunately, but I really loved it for what it was. And then Blue Velvet comes, and this is by far my favorite song on the album, one of my top 5 favorite songs of the year. This song is just gorgeous, and I love the message of the lyrics that the lead singer is talking about how he feels like he's enough to keep this person he loves safe. And I just sort of love the reassuring message the song has, and how it seems to legitimately be showering praise and love on this person. It's one of the most legitimate love songs I've heard in quite some time. And Archangel and Casanova definitely fit better in context of the album, I will say that much. Both songs have grown on me a lot, especially Casanova. I actually really like Casanova now. Hollywood, oh man, what a beautiful song. I love when they bring in the subtle synth flourishes into the track. And it's interesting how it lays out a very intricate story about this person who is in love with 2 people at the same time. The closing moments are great as well, especially the title track. I mean, man, this song just blew me away when I heard it the first time. It really just leaves your mouth hanging open with all that it does. It is a powerful, powerful closer that leaves the album on a definitively strong note. And there's not really many bad moments in here at all. The only track that I didn't really care for was probably Valentine. I didn't really care for the minimalist feel of this song. It just sort of came and went without leaving much of an impression. And also, Raw is a little out of place, but it is still a fun song, so I don't really dislike it too much. And at the end of the day, this is just a masterful album. I think it does what it wants to do very well. It nails the vibe it's going for and creates an atmosphere that is irresistible to dive into. I've returned to this album multiple times already this year, and it's probably my favorite album of the year right now. It is excellent. 4.5 out of 5 stars for me. I recommend you check this one out. Next, let's talk about Post Malone's newest album, 12 Carat Toothache. And like most of my quick album reviews, the genres of music we're going to be talking about are all over the place, so we're moving from a shoegaze-inspired album to a much more straightforward trap pop album. And this one really let me down, I have to admit. I really liked Hollywood's Bleeding. I think it was a really good album. I liked that Post Malone was trying to bridge the gaps between rock and pop. I thought the album had a lot of potential for bringing some rock sounds back into the charts. It was really disappointing to me to see that he entirely ditched that sound on this new album. And I wonder how much of that was a record label move and how much of it was his move as well. I can't really say which one it is, probably a combination of both. But this album was really underwhelming to me. And I say that while also acknowledging that some of the stuff that Post Malone is saying lyrically on this album is a little concerning. But what's even more bothersome than that is when this album contradicts itself constantly. We start with such a dark track like Reputation, and then go into Cooped Up, which is a decidedly more banger-like track that almost entirely refutes the messages of the previous track. It feels totally different, and the way this album flows constantly like that just makes it feel like the emotions sometimes aren't sincere. And while I do like I Like You, a happier song, it might be one of my favorite hit songs of the year so far, and I think Doja Cat works, it still feels, yeah, like a contradiction when paired with a sadder song, which is decidedly less interesting with Gunna's incredibly tired feature. My favorite songs come in the ones where I feel like the production is just really good. I think Love Hate Letter to Alcohol is just beautiful, and captures the contradictions of this album in a bit of a better way than most of the tracks. I also think Fleet Fox's feature is great, although I wish they would have done more than just provided backing vocals. And Wasting Angels is also a pretty good track, although you can't help but notice how much the Kid Laroi is curbing from Post Malone, and it almost makes me wonder if Kid Laroi is going to sadly end up replacing him later down the line, because he is doing much better chart-wise than Post Malone is right now, which is a shame because I don't really care for Kid Laroi that much, but he does at least work in this song pretty well. Once again, this album is just full of contradictions. And when you go from a pretty dark song like Waiting for a Miracle and then end off with One Right Now, which is just a very upbeat pop song that feels totally out of place, the contradictions of this album just keep on stacking up and make it feel like a very big mess. I think Post Malone is a talented vocalist, but time and time again on here, he's repeating the same lyrical tropes that he did from his earlier career days, which I never really cared for, and I just think that some songs here just aren't that interesting. And then you've got a song like Insane, which I couldn't care less for and has some of the worst written lyrics of the year. There's some really cringeworthy moments there, probably one of the worst songs I've heard this year. So sadly, this album was just a bit of a letdown for me. I'm going to give it a 2.5 out of 5 stars. Next, let's talk about Kendrick Lamar's album, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. I've been waiting a while to talk about this one because I really wanted to let it sink in for me, because this is a very layered album. I really like it. I think it's great. I actually think I like it a little better than his previous album. I won't say it's better than his first 3 albums, but I think that this album has a lot of interesting stuff going on in it. I like the almost theatrical vibe this album has in some places. United in Grief definitely starts with that vibe. It feels like something that would be in a musical almost, and it sort of makes sense that this album plays out like a musical, because it is very dramatic in places, and then in other places it goes to a more settled place, and I think exploring it almost like a stage play of Kendrick's life and the things that he's learned as he's grown, and also him coming to grips with his place in the music world and what he wants his place in the music world to be. I think exploring it like a play actually sort of works. I think the first half of this album definitely plays like him playing his sort of larger-than-life persona, the rap persona we've come to know from him, while the second half of the album sees him stepping back and getting a little more intimate and personal. I think N95 is an example of him putting on that big personality, as he talks about things like cancel culture and gives subtle references to the pandemic as well. I mean, even the title of the song is a reference to the popular mask that was worn during the time of the pandemic. And I think this song is a banger personally. I really enjoy it. I think it is one of my favorite hit songs of the year. I think Rich Spirit, interestingly enough, might end up being my favorite on the album. It's a very different sound for Kendrick, but I think the vibe of it really works well. We Cry Together is definitely a very provocative track, I will say that much. I'm not sure whether I love it or dislike it, and I think that's sort of the point with the song, with how provocative it's getting. It's definitely a very vulgar song, and it is an example of a song feeling like a stage play, because both Kendrick and featured vocalist Taylor Page are putting on sort of a bigger-than-life performance and sort of representing archetypes. And I like the resolution of where the song ends up. It's very interesting, I will say that much. The second half of this album, I will admit, hits me a little harder than the first half. I do really like the first half, but I think the second half has a lot more better moments. I think Count Me Out starts off the second half on a very strong note with some more inspirational lyrics. And I think that Mr. Morale has some interesting Stranger Things vibes with its synth groove, which I really enjoy. Mother I Sober is probably my second favorite song on the album. It comes close to being my favorite with just how inward and personal it gets, and it really sends chills up the spine where it goes. I will say that there are some times where he talks about cancel culture that can get a little tiresome to me, and there are some lines here that stick out as a little perplexing to me, like where he talks about how he views that Drake and Kanye reconciled and that made him view things differently, when I have to think that that was more of something that was just done as a purely promotional move for a concert they were doing. But nevertheless, I really enjoyed this album. I think it was excellent from front to back. I didn't really dislike many parts of it. I really enjoyed it overall. I think the only song that really didn't work for me a whole lot was Silent Hill featuring Kodak Black. This song just sort of came across as annoying to me more than anything else. But overall, this album was excellent and still shows that Kendrick is just an artist that continues to be at the top of his game and pushing barriers in rap, and I appreciate him for that. Strong 4 out of 5 stars for me. And now I move on to an album that is decidedly not pushing barriers, and that is Tate McRae's debut album, I Used to Think I Could Fly. This album was a bit of a struggle to get through, I'll admit, because it was boring me to tears. I just found this to be the most generic brand of pop I've heard in quite some time. In some places, it honestly feels a little outdated in the types of pop it is using. Tate McRae isn't an awful vocalist necessarily, but there are some places where her vocals get just a little bit grating in my opinion, like on the song Chaotic, which I just really do not care for at all. But then there are places where she does actually have some interesting things to say or an interesting sound. I think She's All I Want to Be is the best example of this, as she goes into this more pop rock style that I think really works to her advantage, and she should pursue the style more. But overall, I just can't help but feel like this would be a lower tier Billie Eilish album. I already noticed her Billie Eilish inspirations on her earliest song, one of her earliest songs, You Broke Me First. And those feelings are still present across this album, and it just feels, like I said, outdated. A lot of the songs here feel like they could have fit on the charts a long time ago, like in the 2010s with how they're penned. And I just didn't find many of the ways that she talked about relationship tropes to be that interesting. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. I just didn't really care for this that much. It didn't leave me much to write home about outside of She's All I Want to Be, which I think is a legitimately excellent song. And actually, on the note of generic and didn't leave much of an impression with me, I'm going to move into an album on the different side of the spectrum, but one that is equally as disappointing, which is Secret's The Collapse. I really liked this band when I was more of a teenager. I really think their first 2 albums are still pretty great. And even their album that came out a couple years back, where they sort of changed up their sound a little bit to make it more punky. On this album, I really think they went down this brand of metalcore that is just so tired at this point. Just very low screams with super high, clean vocals. It's something that has been done time and time again. And if you're going to do this sound, I feel like you have to do something interesting with it. And this band doesn't. I've seen a lot of people comparing this to Manic by Wage War, and yeah, I think those comparisons are pretty apt. I would actually compare it more to Blueprint's era Wage War personally. It feels more like that type of metalcore, but I think the way they do it, I just don't know. The way Wage War did it on Blueprints just wasn't as generic as the way the band is doing it here. They're trying to be so edgy on a lot of these songs, and it just doesn't work. I will say that both vocalists are talented enough here. I really like Wade Walters. I think he has some good screams. I just wish he would vary them up a little more. The same goes for Richard Rodgers. He's always going for these super high choruses, and while that novelty might work for a little bit and make you be impressed with his talent, doing it time and time again just makes the album really bleed together. Many of the songs here feel very interchangeable with one another. There are still some strong moments here, I can admit that. I think Falling Out is a really good single. I think it's one of the most fun tracks on the album, and maybe the fact that it actually feels the most different on the album because it goes back to more of those punk feelings that they had on their previous album. And I also think Delinquent is a legitimate banger. It's a barn burner with some huge screams and a really good breakdown. But what those 2 songs have is sadly what a lot of the songs lack. A lot of the songs don't have a breakdown that really blows my mind, or necessarily a chorus that grabs my attention and is super catchy. Most of the songs here just are forgettable and don't leave much of an impression on me when I move on to the next song. This isn't a bad album, but it is very, very average, and once again, it's just not one I see myself returning to that much. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. Oh, Jack Harlow, Come Home, The Kids Miss You. This album has been panned to death, and I don't really feel like I have much of value to offer. And mainly the reason for that is that this album doesn't give me much of value to think about. The main thing of value it offers is actually the production. I think the production accounts for the majority of the quality of this album. There are some pretty dang good beats on this album. There are some that I think with a more capable rapper would actually really fly off the page. But with Jack Harlow, they just don't, which is super disappointing to me because I've enjoyed most of his features that he's done over the past year. I mean, Industry Baby most obviously comes to mind, but it seems like when Jack Harlow is left by himself and to his own devices, he's just not as interesting of a personality. Dua Lipa is by far the best song on here. It's the one where he sounds the most energetic, and while the subject matter of the song is a little silly, I still do enjoy it, and I think it's the one where his personality shines through the most. I didn't expect a Drake featured song to be one that I enjoyed, but this one did. And actually, it sort of shows how much that Jack Harlow is taking from Drake's style when he's paired right up against him. And Drake sort of outshines him on his own song, in my opinion. But then there's a lot of the songs outside of the context of that. This album is boring. So boring. There's so many parts of it that are a struggle to get through. Young Harleasy is one of the worst songs of the year with some of the corniest bars I have ever heard. Just read through the song and you'll see cringy bar after cringy bar. I think Justin Timberlake's feature on Parent Trap just doesn't mesh well at all. The same goes with Lil Wayne's feature on Poison. And I mean, just overall, this album is just, it's a vacuous hole of nothingness in my opinion. It has little to no personality, and the only thing that makes it somewhat tolerable is the good production. But Jack Harlow's personality, or lack thereof, really brings it down quite a bit. Enough for me to rate it a 2 out of 5 stars. I didn't really like this one. One of the worst albums of the year, and I wish I liked it better, because I think Jack Harlow can be a likable personality, but he's really not across this album, sadly. Okay, next up, let's talk about Drake's newest album. I've said this before, but I will always try to listen to a new Drake album. In fact, often it doesn't come down to trying because I will hear at least a couple of the songs ad nauseum on the radio because Drake is overplayed to death. At least with this album, it's a little bit more tolerable than his previous two because it's shorter and it's trying a new sound. Even with it being shorter at 46 minutes, it still feels like this album drags. There are some songs on here that go unnecessarily long. I think of Text Go Green, for an example, which is 5 minutes and does nothing remotely interesting with that sound. The house sounds in here are so minimalist and uninteresting and just don't leave an impression on me at all. And Drake, he just sounds bored here once again. I'm so tired of just saying over and over again with this artist that, oh, he sounds bored, but that just continues to be the case. There are some songs on here where he feels like he has a little bit more energy and where he flows pretty well. I think that is the case for both Downhill and especially Overdrive, which is actually a legitimate banger. I did really enjoy that song and I liked the production on it. But for the most part, the production across this album is pretty messy, and the minimalism of it, along with Drake's very uninvested vocal performance, just doesn't leave much of an impression on me at the end of the day. It just leaves me bored and waiting for the album to be over. And there are some moments on here that are mind-numbingly bad as well. That especially goes for Currents, which uses a bed creaking as a beat. And it's clear what the implication is with the bed making this creaking sound over again. What is supposed to be going on? Drake is not particularly subtle. Never has been, really, in my opinion. I just could not care less for this album. It was truly just a boring experience. in fact, could be compared to Jack Harlow's album in some way. I guess the inspiration that Jack Harlow got from Drake off his album was to be boring. And maybe that's fair because that's all Drake has been for a very long time. This marks yet another in Drake's long, miserable career where he hasn't been an interesting artist at all, in my opinion. And I just don't get, for some reason, why people are so interested in hearing this guy's sound out of everyone else. I guess it's because he's safe. I don't know. That's all I can think of. And of course, he's got a massive record label behind him promoting his stuff. But this album is it just does nothing for me. It's just a boring snore fest, and the change in sound doesn't make Drake sound any more interesting. 2 out of 5 stars for me. And finally, let's talk about Motionless in White's newest album, Scoring the End of the World. I'll admit, I've always been a little conflicted on this band. I have never really been entirely a big fan of any of their albums, and I've always felt like they haven't lived up to their full potential. I've always been hopeful for this band to create an album that felt more like something that would be identifiably them, and I think they've finally done it with this album. I think this album is legitimately great. I really enjoy it. I think it is their first album that in a while that has felt really cohesive and like every aspect of it works. And I think it helps that they're sort of unifying under a theme. This is another of many pandemic-inspired albums, and I like the way the band talks about it, especially in delving into some pretty political topics that they have never been this specific before. I will not deny the band has been political in the past. They definitely have. I mean, they have a song called America from one of their previous albums, but I appreciate on this album that they're getting a little more specific in their attacks and even pretty vicious in some places, which I really appreciate as a bold move, calling out the upper class and things like QAnon and fascism as well. I think Meltdown, the opening track, is a really strong way to establish the themes of this album, with some excellent guitar work and incorporations of synths. I think the way they create industrial metal here works really well. It reminds me of Reincarnate done better across this whole album. This album feels like if Reincarnate had been a little more interesting, in my opinion. Werewolf is a huge instant highlight for me. This one definitely feels like it was inspired by Ice Nine Kills thematically. They're going for this much more theatrical feel, and they even do a sort of clever tribute to Michael Jackson in the song that I really like. It's a very different sound for Motionless in White, but it's one that really works for them on this song, and I'd actually like to see them tackle this sound in the future. They nail the sound really well. And then Slaughterhouse comes along, and man, this song is vicious in its lyrical attack. It is one of my favorite songs of the year, and I don't always say like the most intense song on the album is my favorite for the novelty that it's intense, but with this song that is the case. I do love its intensity, and I think Chris Motionless really pushes himself in terms of the screaming that he does. And what I appreciate about this album politically is that it isn't just like constant doom scrolling. There are some songs that bring some more positive feelings, such as We Become the Night, which feels like positively an anthem to me. I really enjoyed this cut and thought it was a lot of fun. And then Corpse Nation comes along and does a very cathartic attack of QAnon, in my opinion. And I really just love the breakdown in this song as well. And the ending track, the title track, is great, especially as it incorporates Mick Gorin, and his soundscapes create something that feels larger than life. Now, there are definitely some problems with this album. I think there are places where the remnants of the flaws of Disguise are there. I think Masterpiece is a song that's way too much like Breaking Benjamin for it to feel original at all, in my opinion. The same goes for Porcelain, although not to as nearly of a large of an extent. I personally think that Cause of Death is a little forgettable, and Red, White, and Boom is definitely the worst on the album. It has this older Motionless in White sound that I don't really care for, and the lyrics are pretty cheesy and use some puns that just make me cringe more than anything else. And Caleb Shomo's feature just doesn't work that much, sadly. He doesn't really mesh that well. But still, this is probably Motionless in White's best album to me. I really enjoyed it overall. I think it was pretty strong, and I think it worked well as a slice of more accessible metalcore and alternative and even industrial metal. Strong 3.5 out of 5 stars for me. So yeah, that ends this episode of Quick Album Reviews. What were your thoughts on any of the albums I suggested or talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. And once again, my name is James. I do reviews of both music and movies, along with the occasional commentary piece. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.